Hello, Civil War literature students. This is your professor, Michael Martin. I'm trying to get a little light in here. It's nighttime. I'm trying to record, so we'll do our best. This brief discussion will be on the novel you're reading by Stephen Crane, The Red Badge of Courage. And I just want to emphasize a couple things. It's not a novel that you can summarize like in any way, shape, or form, because much of it is about the fog of war. And the inability of Henry to kind of make out who's an ally, who's the enemy, what are these shouts? Basically, it's Henry's third-person consciousness embedded within the third-person narrator, and describing the confusion and the fog of the wartime experience. Of course, as you know, for a Civil War literature course, this is a Civil War lit piece. In my opinion, The Red Badge of Courage from 1894 is probably the most famous American piece of literature written about the Civil War. So it feels like something I have to include in this class. I do rate it highly, but I also feel like it's something that students should know. This piece is probably something you've encountered before, maybe in high school. There are multiple film versions, and maybe we can do a final project with it. But what I want to emphasize first would be kind of Henry's transformation as the novel goes on. I don't know how far you are. I want you to really read this piece. Some of the chapters are very brief, and we're reading the first 22 this week, second 2 for next week. But the idea is you're reading about Henry's transformation, and you note immediately early on that he's got a very self-conscious point of view. He's a young man. He was living at a farm with his mother in this one flashback we get. The rest of the piece is straightforward in the present, right? It's the difficulty of the wartime experience. So we don't get much flashbacks, and presumably that's because Henry doesn't have that deep of an inner consciousness, and presumably he is in war, so he's not really flashing back that much. It's just his moment with his mother that we can kind of make sense of. So the other thing I would say about this transformation is this. Note that early on, Henry's main concern is this inner voice telling him at the moment of battle, he will eventually run away, right? So he keeps saying that. He says it to a fellow soldier. He says it to his friend Jim Conklin. He's worried about this sense that, what will I do the moment I encounter the enemy? So note that he's very self-conscious, that he doesn't feel, he's worried that he will not rise to the occasion, and he's very green, he's very young. So Henry is someone who we're going to follow along as if it were a college student going off to fight in war. Crane would write this from a Union vantage point, but immediately note, or something that I should say is interesting, we don't get much in terms of Union or Confederate pro-anti vantage point. Once in a while you get a reference to blue, like the blue of the Union flag. But otherwise, Crane really isn't interested in the two sides in terms of who's right and who's wrong. He's much more interested in showing Henry in his psychological study of this character. So Henry is going to be, this is a psychological novel. As I mentioned, you can't really summarize what occurs, except I can tell you, since you've made it this far, that Henry's fear will come to fruition. You know, as you've been reading, that Henry does turn and run at his first battle, and he feigns an injury. He says he got taken away from his regiment, and so his worst fear comes to fruition. But that's where the real journey comes in. That's where we get to see Henry become the person we'll see by the end of the novel. I don't want to give anything away. But the idea would be he lives with this guilt, and it's a confusing atmosphere. And what he'll do is he'll find voices. He'll find people like him in the Union Army. And look at the mob of people he meets in chapter 12 and elsewhere, for example. Look at the other traveling trove of people that he comes across. And he's basically looking for, I guess, a sense of brotherhood, a sense of belonging, and an awareness that he can cover up the physical shame of being of running away if he has a feigned injury. And of course, once you'll read, he'll get a head injury that he'll say is from the battle. But besides that, Henry's going to encounter all these figures, including his previously mentioned friend, Jim Conklin. And you'll note that his death is particularly disturbing in terms of the spasms he goes through, all of those things. That's how we know that this novel is a realist novel. It depicts the world as it is, in its goriness, in its in almost a documentary style. This piece, I'd want you to know, would be similar to reading Ambrose Bierce's longer works, and would be from the same time period, same philosophy as Bierce in his work. So you've got kind of that element of it. But going back to the characters he meets, he'll come across a tattered man. He'll come across Wilson, who becomes his compatriot throughout most of it. They're young. They brag. They say things about defeating the Confederates that are beyond their control. But most of the piece feels like a confusion for the main character as he sorts through each part of the experience. There's not much to summarize in terms of there are battles, there are skirmishes, there are bombs, there's cannon. There are moments when Henry's by himself and has to deal with his inner guilt that are some of the more poignant ones. But I can point you to at least maybe two things that you could, maybe three things that you latch onto. One would be his friend, as I said, Jim Conklin's death, and the awareness of his own mortality through his friend, and the awareness of the horrors of death, the depiction of the shaking body, and his friend kind of trying to hide away from what's coming. I'd also mention one of the early moments is when he sees a dead body, right? There's a couple dead bodies he sees, but he calls it's with a capital letter, I believe it's question of death. And it's as if death becomes no longer this abstraction for our young man, but something else, an awareness of it that's there in the physical, incarnate form. I'd also mention the flags, right? So Henry kind of has the jingoism or the patriotism that we associate with war, and so he'll have this swelling pride with the blue flag of the Union Army and the American flag. And the flags are mentioned just a couple times, especially when he kind of loses his fervor and his desire to be in war. I'd also mention just how lost he is, almost like a child. He's calling out. He's trying to figure out all of these answers. He gets a rifle to his head by a fellow Union soldier. So his confusion, his disorientation, when Wilson takes him in and kind of nurses him back to health, that's kind of a turning point for him. It feels like he's part of that brotherhood that he sought in so many ways, shapes, or forms. You know that Crane is setting this up as a redemption piece, and that Fleming or Henry will hopefully rise to the occasion later in the novel, at least in terms of novelistic conventions. But as you read, just pay attention as he gets back into the regiment, the final battle that occurs. Much of this piece seems about self-reputation within one's mind, because Henry's just so worried about what will other people think. How can I feign or fake my injury? A very dishonorable thing to do. But much of it is, can he make sense of these voices that are in his head of what would I do at this moment? What would I do at this moment? And kind of make sense of that. So again, this feels very nondescript, right? If there's a point that I kind of want you to glean from it, this piece feels like a nondescript piece. What battle are they in? How would you know it's a Union Army versus? Sorry, my computer went off for a second. How would you know it's the Union Army if you didn't know the context of it? Where? What part of the Southern War arena are we in? Is deliberately vague and nondescript because Crane wants to show us the general wartime experience. And Henry doesn't get much of a backstory. Everything happens in media res. He's already, that means in the middle of action in Latin. He's already in camp. He's already starting things. We get the brief memory of his mother early on. You may want to focus on that. She doesn't want him going off to war, obviously. So again, it's a psychological novel, third-person vantage point, confused person, young man who has suffered but doesn't understand how the suffering is shaping him. And the novel will hopefully have some degree of redemption for him. Again, I will let you decide that. I'll let you read it. And I hope that you're reading the whole thing. It's much better than reading an online summary. I hope that you're making some progress in it. It's one of the 2 long works I'll ask you to read this semester, the other being Charles Fraser's Cold Mountain. So I think I'll leave it there. Short and sweet, hopefully. Sorry about the darkness around me. It's night. I'm trying to record. And I hope everyone is doing well. Take care.